B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Monday, August 3rd, 2020. We're heading back to the late 1920s as Republicans and others in Washington appear to be channeling Herbert Hoover and ready to take us right into a depression. And I've been sounding the alarm here for weeks. And what we see combining now into a kind of trifecta of a looming depression are the cutoff of the unemployment upgrade from Washington, the $600 a week, the rising numbers of evictions and foreclosures, and the millions of people who have lost their health insurance in the middle of this pandemic. This is a true crisis. And we see the Republicans now claiming that it's more important to protect the national debt, to keep that deficit that they have fed with reckless corporate tax cuts back in 2017, huge spending on the military with no real need for it. But when Americans are hurting, and when working families are on the verge of being made homeless, as the meager unemployment benefits are being cut off, it's a very serious issue. And let me start here in California, where more than 1 million people are waiting for unemployment checks that they have been owed for weeks, if not months. While California handled the wave of unemployment filings pretty well in the initial stages, it has become a kind of statewide catastrophe. And at the current moment, there are more than 1 million people who are in limbo, waiting for a check, 889,000 people who are eligible for benefits, but they need to provide more information to the Employment Development Department, which is overwhelmed and laboring with outdated computer systems. And state workers who were redeployed to EDD are bailing. They say that they often have to take breaks from the call centers to cry because they have been talking to tearful Californians who are hitting the wall. There are another 239,000 whose cases are pending resolution, and the head of unemployment says, we hope to have that backlog addressed by, maybe the end of September. Now, the people I know who are waiting for an unemployment check still have some savings. They're not at risk of being thrown out of their homes. But there's so many working people in this state whose jobs have evaporated. And even with the aborted restart of the economy here, they are now back out of work or have been all along since March. And with 30 million people having filed for unemployment nationwide, this problem is not limited to California. And the moratorium on evictions in California is set to expire 2 weeks from now, mid-August. It certainly could be extended, but at this point, we have no indication. It's an emergency judicial order coming from the state Supreme Court. And so we know that there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who cannot make the rent here at the 1st of August. They already owe for unpaid back rent from the last few months. And at a certain point, that risk from a landlord's point of view, that hardship from a tenant's point of view, just becomes too much. So there are some good ideas being tossed around in the legislature in Sacramento. One is an idea, a voluntary one, where landlords would receive tax credits to forgive the rent of tenants who cannot pay. Landlords could use that tax credit starting in 2024 or sell them to another taxpayer sooner for cash. Tenants would pay back their rent interest-free to the state over the course of 10 years, also starting in 2024. And California would be on the hook for those who never pay. There is an inherent risk there that could be in the range of billions of dollars. But the third aspect of what I'm calling a trifecta of a looming depression is that more than 2 million Americans have already lost their employer-provided health insurance coverage. Are you hearing any elected official talk about that? I left a little silence there for you to respond because I'm not. The Democrats continue to promote limited aspects of Obamacare, pre-existing conditions, having just shot down ruthlessly Bernie Sanders' campaign for Medicare for all. Nobody's even talking about any kind of short-term arrangement to get unemployed people on Medicaid. The safety net has not only frayed, it has huge holes in it. So that's why I invoked Herbert Hoover. He was the Republican president who led us into the Great Depression. And we see the stock market soaring, relatively speaking. It's recovered most of the losses that it experienced starting in March. That's propped up by the Fed. The Fed is allowed to borrow endlessly. But when the Democrats propose a $3 trillion bill, and it isn't perfect, but it's got the right components in it, it extends the unemployment $600 a week through January. You do have to be unemployed to get it, you know. Somebody ought to tell Steve Mnuchin and Mitch McConnell, those people who are playing frugal, heartless bastards in this moment. And here's how bad it's gotten. This is an anecdote. This is an isolated case. But in Connecticut, a man has been charged with murder after he allegedly decapitated his landlord during a rent dispute in Hartford. 42-year-old Jerry Thompson was arrested in connection with the death of 64-year-old Victor King, who was his landlord and some sort of roommate. And King, who is reported to be a big champion in bridge, the card game, well, he was slain by a sword. King had called 911 the day before his death to report that Thompson, his roommate and tenant, was waving a sword at him in a threatening and terrorizing manner after King told him to move out due to unpaid rent. And the hardship, the heartbreak, the sleepless nights that so many people are facing right now, it is really critical. And in Washington, I give the Democrats slightly higher marks than the Republicans. But as I said, the Democrats are not addressing the lapse in health care coverage. This is the biggest weakness in the employer-provided health care model, which includes healthy doses of profit-taking at every turn, that was properly slammed by Bernie Sanders. But he's a socialist, and, you know, he's too far left, and we can't even entertain those thoughts. And I fear that we are headed for a deep depression that could leave us with more soup kitchens, more families living on the streets and under the bushes. There's a big open space across the street from the secret studio here. About 3 times a year, people go under their limited trees there, but there are about 6 areas where you can set up camp. And they do. And within about 3 weeks, the cops discover it and roust them. We have tents in our major cities on the sidewalks, San Francisco, Los Angeles in particular. And that's only going to get worse. Some people will be able to hold on to a car or a van and sleep in that. But I don't think we are at all prepared for the dire consequences of the dithering in Washington, D.C. And the sheer cruelty of those who want to claim that suddenly we need fiscal discipline. Well, show me by repealing the 2017 Trump tax cuts, the corporate tax cuts. That's $2 trillion right there. You got the Republicans willing to spend $1 trillion, the Democrats asking for $3 trillion. Repeal the tax cuts, and it'll have it'll have less impact on the ongoing debt. So the Donald is posturing. He is feigning concern for people who are facing evictions. Quote, a lot of people are going to be evicted, but I'm going to stop it because I'll do it myself if I have to. I have a lot of powers with respect to executive orders, and we're looking at that very seriously right now. But what are you going to do, Don? A lot of landlords are mom and pops. And the $600 unemployment benefit was the most efficient way to get money into people's hands so they could pay the rent, pay those landlords, and keep the whole system from collapsing. But I think we're on the verge of a major economic implosion. And we see a lot of political posturing. Pelosi does seem to get the severity of the situation. Quote, it's absolutely essential that we reach agreement. The numbers are spiking in terms of the life and death, as well as infections in terms of the virus. So my view is that if you want to open the economy and the schools, you just have to defeat the virus, and we haven't done that. And this is before we contemplate what the experts are counseling, which is that we didn't do it right in the spring, and at least in some states, we need to go back into shelter in place, which will, of course, delay the economic recovery. And here's the other idea I'll offer to Mr. Trump, if he's going to do it himself. He has stolen billions from the Pentagon budget to build his frickin' wall on the southern border. We'll get to the Supreme Court, which once again has enabled this madness. But Trump could steal more money from the Pentagon. There is $70 billion there in funding that's basically just set aside for future wars. A blank check to give Don the opportunity to invade someplace. If Trump wants to use his authority, he could declare an emergency for the people and grab money from the Pentagon budget to fund the unemployment, to fund rental support. But, of course, these ideas could never even be contemplated in the minds of those who are such committed capitalists and greedy MFs. So over the weekend in Portland, a generally much more peaceful scene, smaller crowds, but protests do continue. But there was no tear gas. There were no federal goons in the streets. Portland police did handle one demonstration that was away from the Hatfield Federal Building across the river on the east side of Portland, where an unlawful assembly was declared on Saturday night. near the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office. They said protesters threw bottles and pointed lasers. And apparently some people are gaming the court order to protect reporters and legal observers because people wearing clothing with press written on it were among those who were allegedly throwing things at officers. But compared to the skirmishes of the period when the Homeland Security troopers were on the streets of Portland, things have calmed down immensely. And the official, who was the acting Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the Department of Homeland Security, Sieg Heil, Brian Murphy, has been reassigned because he's the one who was sending out open-source intelligence reports containing Twitter posts of journalists, particularly those who had published classified materials. So they're pretending that they were outraged by this exposure when you can bet several lottery tickets that it was sanctioned from the very top. In Seattle, also a quiet weekend on the streets as city council members are struggling to come up with meaningful cuts to the budget of the police department as demanded by activists and protesters. And I do understand this. You cannot just take a big axe and whack a budget of a department like that overnight. There are union contracts, there are staffing requirements, and there is a fundamental that I believe we need some sort of conscious law enforcement. So they are working to try to sharply reduce the budget for the next fiscal year. And there are talks about renaming the department, changing it from the police department to the Department of Community Safety. They want to shift responsibilities. And I support that. I hope that protesters will have enough patience to understand that these changes don't happen overnight, even if that's what people want. Now, back in June, a poll of Seattle adults, 54% agreed with redirecting half of the police department's budget to community groups, while a mere 34% disagreed. So if those views are holding, I think that the council has the support of a broad cross-section of the citizenry, and we'll see where it all leads. Now, there was a protest at or near the home of Seattle Police Chief Carmen Best. She lives in Snohomish County. And after the protesters dropped by her neighborhood, she has begged the city council to forcefully call for the end of these tactics. Residents blocked a road into the chief's neighborhood. Multiple posts appearing to come from neighbors referred to protesters as terrorists. At least one included a photo of a gun. Best's letter to the council said her neighbors were concerned by such a large group and didn't allow protesters to trespass or engage in other legal behavior in the area, despite repeated attempts to do so. Some are questioning the wisdom and the practicality of asking the city council to tell demonstrators where they can and cannot protest. I'll tell you a quick story. A few years back, when eBay billionaire Meg Whitman was running against Jerry Brown and spent $125 million to try to buy the governorship here, she was sharply opposed by the National Nurses United Union. And I was working as a kind of casual consultant to the union, and I participated in an action where we took about 10 busloads of nurses, all decked out in red scrubs, the uniform of NNU, and we went to Atherton, And Atherton is one of the Bay Area's richest communities. It's at the north end of Silicon Valley. The homes there start at $3 million for a, 2-bedroom, 1-bath. And it shocked the neighbors that a whole parade of these red uniformed nurses were marching down their street and to Meg Whitman's house. Now, we were very careful to observe the law, and the police were there to monitor the situation. Nobody trespassed on her property. We did invite her to come out using a bullhorn, but that was the extent of it. And somebody else who doesn't like protests in front of his home, the official residence of the Prime Minister, or sometimes they call him the Crime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. And he gets increasingly shrill. He slammed the media for inflaming the protests, for misrepresenting incidents of violence against the protesters. There has never been such a distorted mobilization. I wanted to say Soviet, but it has already reached North Korean terms of the media in favor of the protests. He said the media ignored wild and unfettered incitement, including daily calls to murder the Prime Minister and his family. Now, he is so shrill that I don't know exactly what he's referencing. But he said that the street art of Netanyahu's Last Supper that we described last week, I think it's on the streets of Tel Aviv, was an incitement to a crucifixion. And, that is such an exaggeration that we have to treat everything that Bibi Netanyahu says with that proverbial grain of salt. But Netanyahu's older son, Yair, has been hauled before a court and told to cease and desist for the next 6 months after he tweeted the home addresses and cell phone numbers of people who've been leading the protests against his father, including the actions in front of the official residence. And a judge named Dorit Feinstein, I don't think related to our senator from California, issued this order. I instructed him to refrain for the next 6 months from harassing the petitioners in every shape, way, and form. Speaking of Israel, Ilhan Omar, the congresswoman from Minneapolis, who has drawn the ire of the Zionist forces here in the United States, she's being heavily targeted by allies of Israel. They've already spent $2 million trying to defeat her in her bid for a second term in Congress. And she's running against a candidate named, his last name is Melton Meux. I'm sorry, I didn't pick up his first name in my review of the copy. Anyway, he is currently trailing her by 37 points. And ordinarily, political actors would not waste money on a race with that big of a gap. But this is about ideology, not about pragmatism. So I'm looking at an AP story that was published in my Sunday San Francisco Chronicle under the byline of Steve Peoples. And it's scary. It opens this way: as the November 3rd presidential vote nears, there are fresh signs that the nation's electoral system is again under attack from foreign adversaries. Intelligence officials confirmed in recent days that foreign actors are actively seeking to compromise the private communications of U.S. political campaigns, candidates, and other political targets. Now, how do they know it's not that 17-year-old kid in Florida who pulled off the Twitter hack? Now, in the third paragraph, they concede there is no evidence that America's enemies have yet succeeded in penetrating campaigns or state election systems. And while this article does not immediately point the finger of Russia, which is slightly refreshing, well, they do toward the end of the piece. Anyway, there's this one paragraph floating near the end that just says foreign interference played a significant role in the 2016 election, of course. Of course, they say. We all know that. And if you listen on a regular basis and you've heard some of our recent in-depth interviews, I have frequently made the case that the proven foreign interference in 2016 came from Israel. And I want to commend the veteran intelligence professionals for sanity, led by Bill Binney and Ray McGovern. Their latest open memo is addressed to Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House. It's published today at consortiumnews.com. And they make the case, as Pelosi has expressed her frustration that the Trump intelligence community is not willing to share more information about, quote-unquote, Russia's continued interference in the 2020 election campaign. They refer to the recent article, which I'm going to dive into next, by David Sanger in the New York Times, which repeats the unproven claims of Russian hacking from 2016 and that they hacked the DNC and gave the spoils to WikiLeaks. And they remind the Speaker of James Clapper and his dark role in the false claims that Iraq had WMD 18 years ago. They quote Sean Henry, the head of CrowdStrike, whose testimony from December of 2017 didn't surface until May of 2020, which has not been covered by the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the other drivers of the Russiagate narrative. And the VIPSs ask, we wonder if you yourself were made aware of Henry's testimony. They note that there still are no consequences for the people who lied about WMD in Iraq. There are no consequences for the people who lied about the Russiagate conspiracy theory. And so they argue, and they sidestep the questions related to Russia Bountygate in Afghanistan. I'm not sure why, but I'll get to that in a moment. And they hammer David Sanger of the Times. His observation amounts to a poignant, if unintended irony. His mantra regarding Russian hacking has been nothing if not consistent. And these experts say that the Russian hacking claim has all but dissolved. So to Sanger's article, and I've linked to it in the show file for today's podcast, the headline reads, Trump still defers to Putin as he dismisses intelligence. And once again, they tie together 2016 Russian meddling, which the Times has not backed off from even one iota, with the recent claims that Russia was paying bounties to Taliban fighters to kill Americans in Afghanistan. And the backpedaling on that scenario was much faster than on Russiagate. But it remains in play, even though there's no evidence of this. And we saw the outcome of the whole meme was for Congress to attach a rider to the Pentagon budget bill that ties Trump's hands from removing our troops from Afghanistan, even though we're down below 10,000 there. So Sanger once again tries to embarrass Trump because he didn't bring up in his recent phone call with Putin the bounty question. Sanger rehashes that 4 years ago this week, the CIA was coming to the conclusion that Russia was responsible for the hacking of the DNC servers. They never reached that conclusion, Mr. Sanger. They floated an assessment, and they allowed people to believe it. But they never proved the case. Mueller didn't prove it, and the Times hasn't proven it with all the yellow journalism that's based on anonymous sources and calculated leaks. And the one aspect of Sanger's article here which is true is that Trump in cutting our troop presence in Germany from 36,000 down to 24,000, that Trump repeatedly talks about NATO fees that member nations are supposed to pay. And Sanger schools the president by saying there are no such fees. And that is correct. You don't pay fees. There's no clubhouse at NATO. You simply agree to spend a certain amount on your own military, and then it's a mutual aid agreement for the member states. But the kind of, this is what drives the fake news claims by Trump. It gives them some legitimacy. But the people on the inside at the Times and the other corporate media outlets are oblivious to it. In other news, Trump continues to pound on the risks, at least to Republicans, from mail-in balloting. And the Washington Post reports, this surprised me, that as much as 70% of the voting population will be able to vote by mail, 77%, according to a Washington Post tracker of state rules. I thought that number was much lower because of the restrictions that many states place. You have to have a doctor's note if you're going to be unable to vote, or you have to send an airline ticket and say, I'm going to be in Barcelona. And so even Republicans are getting concerned about Trump's broadside attacks, more than 70 since this spring, on mail-in balloting. And surveys show that a disproportionate number of Democrats are signing up to vote by mail, but not Republicans. And Republicans might find themselves in line, as they've witnessed in Atlanta or in Milwaukee, where African Americans suffer from access to the polls when they don't receive their requested absentee ballots. They're forced to vote in person. And with reduced polling places, they end up in line for 4 to 5 hours. Now, one of the other issues that is being raised is that the games that are being played at the Postal Service by the new Postmaster General are intended to fuck up the postal system so that they can't process the mail out of blank ballots and the mail in of completed ballots. And I really find that a stretch, because this is the most basic function of the post office, to deliver mail locally. And for an average voter, their ballot is only going, 10, maybe 50 miles at the most. And to suggest that they're unable to collect, bring to a post office, sort into a bin for the local voting office, and then deliver that? I don't know. I understand that the new guy has cut overtime, and he's basically saying that if you can't get to a certain piece of mail tomorrow, it'll wait today. It'll wait until tomorrow. But I don't see, honestly, at least so far, how that can gum up the whole system. And I don't see how it would help Trump. So we will wait and see how that plays out. As I referenced earlier, late on Friday, the Supreme Court rejected a request from environmental groups to stop construction of the border wall while the administration seeks review of an appeals court loss. And this is interference by the highest court that is really, it's beyond the pale. Because the lower courts made a very strong case that Congress had rebuffed Trump's request for funding for the wall. Then he declared a phony emergency, diverted funds from various accounts at the Pentagon, and started construction. And a year ago, by the same exact vote, 5-4, with the same allegedly liberal justices on the losing end, the court allowed the administration to start using $2.5 billion in Pentagon money. So it was a 2-1 vote at the Ninth Circuit here in San Francisco that ruled against the administration. And now, without hearing the case, or even giving a date about when the court would hear oral arguments, much less reach a decision. They have simply ordered the appeals court to be overruled, and that construction can continue. And by the time the court gets to it, the damn wall's going to be finished. And this is a passive-aggressive approach by the court, where it skirts its responsibilities and enables a president to commit these diversions, which I think amount to theft. And it's one of the elements of the negotiations in Washington right now, where the White House has insisted on plugging in about $10 billion worth of Pentagon money, and most of that is to backfill the accounts that Trump stole from. Where does that game end? And why does the court allow the president to bulldoze the will of Congress, which is supposed to control the purse, and allow him to, steal that money from the Pentagon budget? The court also intervened late on Thursday, interfering in the election processes of the state of Idaho. This was another emergency petition where the majority on the court, the Republicans, were able to tell Idaho that they could not use e-signature gathering for a statewide initiative that would increase funding for education. And put aside the purpose of the ballot measure, the initiative. This is citizen action. It's democracy in motion. And because of the pandemic and the difficulty of gathering signatures at grocery stores or going door to door, the petitioners wanted to conduct the initiative using electronic signature gathering, or asking the court to just put the damn initiative on the ballot and let the voters decide. So Republican leaders immediately challenged the ruling, went directly to the U.S. Supreme Court to demand a stay, and the court complied. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. There's Terry Paris, who is recovering from serious surgery. Terry, I hope you're doing well today. Brian Carey, Anthony Abel, and Don Cisney. They all chip in a few bucks a month to help support me. And you can do it too. Just visit peterbcollins.com/sign up. You can also make a contribution of any amount at any time. And there is a $1 subscription for people who'd like a 24-hour pass, for example, to listen to a recent in-depth interview that is still behind the paywall. Over the Black Agenda Report, Danny Haifong takes on the so-called letter, the public letter that came from authors and intellectuals that was published in Harper's. And this was a lament about cancel culture. And it was mostly provoked by the New York Times sacking the editor of the opinion section, James Bennett, for publishing Tom Cotton's Send the Troops to the Streets opinion piece. And as you may know, I supported the Times' decision to publish that. I don't agree with Tom Cotton or his position in that particular piece. But I don't believe in censorship, and I believe that he is an odious but legitimate figure whose views should be published so that people can decide they don't agree with them. But it was expanded to include so-called cancel culture. And while I acknowledge that there have been some abuses, that some of these people who've had one-on-one altercations around race, I'm thinking of the woman in Central Park taking on the bird guy with the same last name, who happens to be black and she's white. Also, there was a woman in San Francisco in one of the wealthier sections of town, Pacific Heights, who lectured a homeowner claiming he didn't own the home because he had erected a Black Lives Matter poster. And I think we get it into extremes of public shaming, and then employers of these people fire them because they're embarrassed by all that shaming. I do deplore that. But I was very frustrated watching Bill Maher's show on Friday as he trotted out Barry Weiss, who resigned from the New York Times in protest of cancel culture. She also signed on to the Harper's letter. That was the centerpiece of their discussion. But Bill Maher, who is either just ignorant or intentionally ignorant, never brought up the history of Barry Weiss. He's pals with her, and he sucks up to her. He embraces her very broad definition of anti-Semitism. And Barry Weiss has been a canceller herself. If you don't agree with her on the policies of the State of Israel and you criticize them, she tags you as anti-Semitic, and that is canceling. And likewise, I have argued that many of these same people, and I can't say to a person that those who signed the Harper's letter hold this view, but I've seen so many condescending white people, and there was a post in my Facebook feed just this morning saying that we've got to get rid of the phrase defund the police. And as I have argued, they didn't ask me if that was a good slogan or not. And nobody needed to ask me or these self-appointed critics. Yeah, I would prefer something that is a little more nuanced and better defined. But it is not my place to lecture protesters in the street who have serious grievances against police brutality, abuse of authority, bias and discriminatory treatment. No, it's not my place to tell them what their slogan should be. And so I really have to side with Danny Haifong here in most respects. Now, these are people who don't have any clue about how black voices have been silenced, canceled for generations. And suddenly, when white intellectuals face the same treatment, well, their response is to group sign a letter and then argue that publicly. Cyrus Vance Jr., the district attorney in Manhattan, is suggesting that it's investigating Trump and his company for possible bank and insurance fraud. It comes back to the testimony of Michael Cohen, who said that Trump inflated his net worth for the purposes of getting loans and deflated his net worth for the purposes of paying taxes. So I think that this is a good development, but Trump will be able to use a lot of legal maneuvers to prevent any imminent or meaningful action. In a related matter, Deutsche Bank has opened an internal investigation because last week Jared Kushner, the Crown Prince, released his annual personal financial report. He and Ivanka banked about $36 million last year. They're just struggling to get by. Anyway, it disclosed the proceeds of a transaction involving an apartment and a front company called Burgle 715 Associates. Well, it turns out they sold that apartment through that front company to their personal banker at Deutsche Bank, Rosemary Vrablic. And this deal goes back a few years, 2013 or so. But it is a deep conflict of interest for Ms. Vrablic, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, to engage in a transaction with a client. And the judge who is presiding over one of the cases related to Jeffrey Epstein and Deutsche Bank, which was handling his finances even after he was convicted in Florida for the limited charges related to his predatory sexual behavior. Esther Salas is that judge. And it was 2 weeks ago yesterday that a gunman came to her home and shot dead her only son, Daniel, and seriously wounded her husband. So she released a video statement today. It's pretty emotional, and I've linked to a clip of it provided by The Guardian. That's in the show file of today's podcast at peterbcollins.com. And it's very personal. She talks about her last exchange with her son. It was his birthday. And then the doorbell rang, and Daniel went upstairs to answer it and took a bullet to the heart. It's truly tragic. And Judge Salas appears to embrace the official story that the accused shooter, Roy Den Hollander, who's also accused of a shooting death of an alleged adversary here in California a few days before this event. Well, she is not commenting on his motivation. But she does call for better security for federal judges, and she said, look, my home address is widely published. It's available to way too many people. And I support her in an effort to protect herself and her colleagues. At the same time, I was hoping she was going to make a statement calling for some meaningful gun regulation. Here's our daily COVID-19 update prepared by Linda Lewis. Worldwide total confirmed cases at 18 million, total deaths 690,000. In the United States, the confirmed caseload is up at 4.6 million, total deaths edging up to 155,000 today. And I want to point out that there have been some vagaries in data reporting. Some of it's explainable. Florida shut down its testing for a couple of days, particularly in South Florida, in anticipation of the hurricane that we're all grateful stayed off the coast. It didn't hit the shores. And Texas also has had some interruptions, they claim, due to system upgrades. But I also suspect that the effort to shift data collection away from the CDC and to a private contractor controlled by the Trump administration may have something to do with the figures that we're seeing. So, with that in mind, the U.S. recorded 47,000 new cases, the lowest figure since July 6. We had been seeing numbers in the 60 to 70,000 range routinely last week. California recorded 9,000 cases Saturday after a peak of 12,000 on July 21st. Texas did not report cases at all due to their so-called systems upgrade. Florida posted 4,700 new cases, an unusually low number. Likewise, I looked up at the Johns Hopkins dashboard. The number of fatalities reported in the last 24 hours dropped sharply. So I'm not trying to undermine potential good news. I'd love to see these numbers drop and drop fast. But I suspect that there is some manipulation along with some anomalies, as I have suggested. Of the 3,141 American counties, 1,918, or 60%, are currently seeing an epidemic outbreak. There are 807 counties across the country seeing spreading trends, and the primary affected states are Arizona, Louisiana, and Tennessee. And in Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, South Carolina, North Carolina, Delaware, and Maryland, they are seeing epidemic or spreading trends. Daily cases are showing signs of a decline as deaths appear to be rising. So there are a number of experts who are saying that a second shutdown is going to be necessary, at least in some regions. Michael Osterholm at the University of Minnesota, quote, right now we're experiencing a national forest fire of COVID that is readily consuming any human wood that's available to burn. When you have something like this happening, there's no way that traditional testing and tracing is going to have any meaningful impact. I liken it to trying to plant your petunias in the middle of a Category 5 hurricane. Mark Lipsitch at the Harvard School of Public Health, I think it's the right response when you have a nearly controlled epidemic and you're trying to mop up the spills. and that's related to trying to rely on testing. He says, but we're not there in most places. In many places, we're engaging in collective wishful thinking. So Trump is openly attacking his top advisors on the coronavirus. And part of the problem is that Deborah Birx, who is the one with those lovely scarves, who tries to avoid poking the bear too much. Over the weekend, she warned that people living in multi-generational households in an area experiencing an outbreak should wear their masks inside the home. And she said that this is different from the spring, that rural areas are not immune. Another target, Admiral Brett Giroir. He coordinates the coronavirus testing response, and he went on TV and he gently dismissed hydroxychloroquine, saying, at this point in time, there have been 5 randomized controlled placebo-controlled trials that do not show any benefit to HCQ. So at this point in time, we don't recommend that as a treatment. Dr. Anthony Fauci, he told the House Select Committee, subcommittee on the coronavirus Friday, there were some states that did it very well, some states did not. We started off with a very difficult baseline of transmission that was going on when we tried to open up the country. Then we saw an increase of cases to 20, 30, 50,000, and a couple of weeks ago it was up to 70,000 a day. Speaker Pelosi, appearing on ABC's This Week on Sunday, lumped Dr. Birx together with Trump. And she dismissed the credibility of Birx because of the disinformation spread by the president. Now, she was more polite. On TV, her quote, I think the president has been spreading disinformation about the virus. She is his appointee, so I don't have confidence there. No. But Politico quotes her in a meeting with Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin and White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. One of them probably leaked that to Politico. Deborah Birx is the worst, Pelosi said. Wow, what horrible hands you're in. Pelosi elaborated on CNN today, quote, I don't have confidence in anyone who stands there while the president says swallow Lysol and it's going to cure your virus. There has to be some responsibility. If the president is saying these things, who is advising him that this is okay and enabling that to happen while millions of people have died? Nancy, millions of people have not died. So that creates the opening for Trump, who fires back, of course, on Twitter. So crazy Nancy Pelosi said horrible things about Dr. Birx, going after her because she was too positive on the very good job we're doing on combating the China virus, including vaccines and therapeutics. In order to counter Nancy, Deborah took the bait and hit us. Pathetic. Then Trump went after Fauci. He publicly criticized him by tweeting, wrong, rebuking him for his comments on the new surge of COVID cases while European countries are having more success in getting it under control. Once again, the president promoted this lie that if we weren't testing so much, we wouldn't have more cases. And how he thinks that is persuasive or compelling is just beyond me. And Peter Navarro, he's the hitman for Trump. He's nominally a trade advisor, but he went after the testing czar Brett Giroir for dismissing hydroxychloroquine as a treatment. So Navarro was advising CNN anchor Jim Ciuto to have Dr. Harvey Risch from Yale come on the show. He has written favorably about the use of hydroxychloroquine in the early stages after the coronavirus has been detected. And there has been a little gentle pushback from the Yale School of Public Health, where Risch is perched, And they are saying Yale-affiliated physicians used HCQ early in the response to COVID-19, but it is only used rarely at present due to evidence that it is ineffective and potentially risky. Dr. Risch does acknowledge past advisory consulting work with two of the more than 50 manufacturers of the drug hydroxychloroquine. I do find his commentary interesting, and I remain undecided about HCQ. I have tried to separate myself from rejecting it just because Trump promotes it, and because the alleged risks of heart problems have not been seen surfacing in patients, COVID patients who have taken it. I still await a definitive decision on its efficacy in relation to COVID-19. So the White House, of course, spins relentlessly and uses whatever data it thinks will be most persuasive. But it has shifted away from claiming low mortality rates because the number of deaths jumped during July, and in consequence, the case mortality rate rose from, it doubled from 0.9 to 1.8%. And I caution you that so many of these figures really can't be trusted because of the wide difference in standards of what is a COVID death and how it's reported, what is the difference between somebody who dies of COVID and somebody who dies with it, together with other complications. The standards vary from one state to the next, and now we have to fear that the data are being massaged and manipulated when they are collected by the federal government. So the battle over masks is heating up. A Delta flight was forced to turn around and return to the airport after two passengers on a flight from Detroit to Atlanta on July 23rd refused to wear their masks. And Delta has underscored its policy. You cannot board a Delta plane unless you have a mask on, according to its CEO, Ed Bastian. And Dick Atlee, our listener in Maine, sends along some information that I think we should note. And whether you believe that masks are effective or it's just some form of social control, one issue we're having is that people are discarding them and creating a whole new level of litter and pollution in the oceans. The French nonprofit Opération Mer Propre, which would be proper sea or something like that, they pick up litter along the Côte d'Azur, the Mediterranean there in southern France, and divers have found COVID waste, dozens of gloves, masks, bottles of hand sanitizer, along with the usual beer cans and soda bottles. And there was a big protest in Berlin on Sunday. The official estimate is 20,000 people took part in demonstrations. The organizers said it was 1.3 million. Now, maybe they asked Trump to count their crowd for them, I don't know. But it was a substantial demonstration of people who don't want to wear masks and who want the pandemic to be declared over. And while I do understand the frustration and impatience that people have, I think a lot of it is political, and we see that in great relief here in the United States. Now, I've been trying to get a solid source for what I'm about to tell you, but on Facebook, somebody posted two different photos of a scene in Tampa where Trump arrived on Air Force One and gave a speech that turned into a kind of mini rally right there on the tarmac. The official photo released by the White House shows a pretty substantial crowd. Another photo that is side by side with it here on Facebook shows that the crowd was about 1/5 or 1/6 of the impression created by the official White House photo. And on close examination, you see a Photoshop effect. In particular, there is one person in a very bright red jacket or hoodie, and in the official White House version, that garment shows up repeatedly in the crowd in a pattern that's pretty easy to detect. So I guess that crowd size thing is still a big issue, a big obsession for the Trumpster. The White House has announced more deals. They have committed now $8 billion to drug companies to manufacture vaccines and distribute them. Only we don't got no vaccine. The latest beneficiaries are the French drug maker Sanofi, which also makes hydroxychloroquine, and reports indicate that Trump and Jared Kushner own shares in a fund that owns shares in Sanofi. That's the way I recall it. So Operation Warp Speed is signing these deals. The partner for Sanofi is the British pharmaceutical giant GlaxoSmithKline. They will receive federal funding to pay for clinical trials and manufacturing the vaccine. In a separate report at the New York Times, scientists expressed their concerns about political influence over the Warp Speed project and the risk that they will rush into a vaccine to try to meet a deadline, say, before Election Day. Government researchers are fearful of political intervention in the coming months. They're struggling to ensure that the government maintains the right balance between speed and rigorous regulation. And I think there's a huge risk here that they're going to put some kind of a potion out there early, and I'm sure not going to roll up my sleeve for it. Last week, the Senate abruptly halted a hearing to try to confirm General Tata, Anthony J. Tata, a retired one-star Army general turned Fox News commentator, and Trump had appointed him to a post at the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense for Policy. That nomination has now been withdrawn, and instead, he's going to basically have the same job. He's been designated as the official performing the duties of the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, an end run that doesn't require Senate confirmation. Brilliant. And finally today, have you received a package in the mail containing demon seeds from China? Maybe you'd prefer to call them Wuhan seeds. I don't actually know where in China they've come from. I have not received such a package, but news accounts say that people all over the country have received a little plastic sealed packet of fairly large seeds. They look like the size of a peanut. And some people have actually popped them into the ground, and what is produced is a large white fruit, orange flowers, bright green leaves. Now, is this just a gift from China to help foliate the United States? Or is this an insidious plot to send seeds that grow plants that will, listen into your TikTok? Turn it over to Chinese authorities? If you have received a packet of these seeds, please send me an email, peter@peterbcollins.com. Tell me what you've done with them and if they have produced any plants that you like or that you're scared to death of. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place, even at Mar-a-Lago. I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling